My discussions with Pete were talk about not just the view from your view of experience of civil society, but of Scotland. How is this going to dovetail with the Scottish debate?
Okay, thank you very much, and thanks everybody for staying on so late. I can't start this by going straight into the Brexit thing, because it is worth just saying a little bit about our own referendum, right? And to be honest, if people really want to stay in Europe, where we are at the moment is pathetic, okay? In Scotland, we're out of the blocks by this stage, well ahead, 2 years ahead of the referendum, 2.5 years ahead of the referendum, people were talking about it. And if people think it's important to stay in Europe, whether it's because we don't want another war, or because we want to create jobs, or we want to maintain our animal welfare standards, we really need to be doing something more about this. And it's no good in my book, the Food and Drink Federation, saying, oh, we've got to wait for the government to give us the go-ahead before we can say anything. If people think it's important, they need to start saying something. They need to make the positive arguments now, because there is a deep asymmetry in this conversation. The people who want to leave Europe say, and they don't just say it in the UK, they say it all across Europe, they say the EU is arrogant. They say the EU is wasteful. They say the EU is bureaucratic. And they say the EU is remote. And we've added to that in the UK by a sort of decades-long, 30-year-long policy of sort of delinquency about Europe, where most people in our government can't even remember that we are already in Europe. We don't go to Europe when we cross that bit of water. So we have been delinquent for 30 years about what membership of the EU brings. And we've sort of pretended that there aren't newspapers, so we can say one thing at home about how awful the Europeans are, and then go and say something different when we get to Brussels and we think people can't read. So we've been delinquent about this for far too long. So I just want to say something else about the referendum. What the referendum did was we had something very, very positive that the Yes campaign started to work for. It wasn't any good talking about fear in the No campaign. In the end, though, there were some shared symbols that probably made more difference than anything else. There was the same demographic shift. Older people voted to stay in the Union, younger people voted to leave. And if you just wash that through for another 10 years, there'd be a very clear majority to leave. But there were shared symbols. There was the Queen, there was the pound, and most importantly, there was Doctor Who. And when people thought they weren't going to get to see Doctor Who in an independent Scotland, 55% voted to stay. But we don't really have any shared symbols with Europe. And it's really important to recognize that. There's very little for the older generation that ties us symbolically to Europe. We don't think of ourselves as Europeans. So if we want to stay in for all the good reasons that all the speakers have talked about today, we really need to get on and mobilize. And we need to be much more sort of passionate and inclusive in the way we argue for Europe. Because actually just saying, it's a sensible thing to do, it's the rational paradigm, look at all the jobs that will be lost. The people who want to get out of Europe feel it in here. They feel it in here, it's visceral. They don't want to be in Europe anymore. They want to rediscover something that they feel they've lost. It's hugely important to people, so it needs to be hugely important to us. Otherwise, we will sleepwalk into the most catastrophic mistake we've made for a very long time. Well, no, just since last week, actually, but for quite a long time. Okay, so I can say a little about Scotland. Scotland's 65% for staying in, which is different. And as people have said earlier, if there's a vote to leave, and Scotland and Northern Ireland and Wales vote to stay, all hell will break loose. That is for sure. So we will be out of the UK within 10 years if that's the case. So it's a very big decision for the UK. It's not just a sort of administrative reshuffle. And Scotland's different in a couple of respects. Obviously, we're even more dependent on EU subsidies for our farmers than the rest of the UK. 85% of Scotland is less favoured area. It is harder to grow food in lots of parts of Scotland than it is in the south of England. So we're even more dependent. Fishing matters much more in Scotland too. You look at a map of Scotland, a lot of water. So EU is more important to Scotland than it is to the rest of the to England. But it's not just like a subsidy thing. There's a sort of emotional tie to Brussels, same as there is in Ireland. We're a little bit closer to feeling ourselves having to be part of Europe because we're a small country. Okay, I'm just going to give you a little bit about some of the policy differences, some of which are particularly relevant to European membership, some which not. So, as you know, we've come out to extend the moratorium on GMs and make it a ban for the foreseeable future, although there's still a lot of controversy around that in Scotland. We've recently introduced some marine protected areas off the coast of Scotland, which has been a real bit of progress to actually protect some areas from overfishing and restore some marine biodiversity. We're going to be bringing in food waste mandatory targets sometime in the next few weeks, which is progress again. Cabinet Secretary Ritchie is very keen on that. We've got a very, very lively debate going on at the moment, as you know, on land reform. How far we're going to get in the next 10 years is in doubt, but we are going to be setting up a land commission, and we're going to look at a new basis for what owning land is about, what responsibilities come with owning land. So that'll be some interesting change. There's been a big move, as you know, towards community land ownership. So we've got about 600,000 acres in community ownership at the moment in Scotland, and that is confidently expected to go up to 1 million acres by 2020. So that whole bit about taking some of the bigger estates, putting them into community ownership and actually revitalising them and bringing jobs into those has been a very, very positive feature of the Scottish scene. They're not huge food producing areas, but they are producing more food than they were. We're making a bit of a difference on food poverty. There's some recent research came out last week, polling by Oxfam, showing that there's a stronger sense in Scotland that the government should be doing something about food poverty, and that it's not the fault of the individual, it's the fault of our economic system. And it looks as if we may be implementing the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights into Scottish law. So the First Minister made a very positive commitment to looking at that in the last couple of weeks. So there's a consensus in Scotland we need to do better than food banks as a way of addressing food poverty, and there's some movement on that. I think both the manifestos will say something quite strong on that. Nod to Peter, our procurement legislation has got a nice clause in it about ensuring high standards, or having regard to high standards of animal welfare, and we're hoping that will provide a bit of a ratchet in Scotland, because as Compassionate World Farming has shown, if you're going to improve animal welfare standards, lots of other good things come with that too. So if we can get procurement people really understanding that their decisions make a difference to the lives of thousands and millions of animals, that's a good thing. And we've also got a commitment to having local food growing plans, which we sorely need, because we don't have enough allotments or community gardens yet in Scotland. Okay, so there's some differences going on in Scotland at the moment. On farming itself, we've got some very good words. We're talking about Scotland becoming a world leader in green farming, but in fact, in practice, we're still very much locked into sort of productionist paradigm, and we haven't really started to move on from that yet. So that's where we are. I just want to say a couple of things about this Brexit thing, because I think if Scotland was independent, alone in the world, we had 100% control of what we did, and Norwich was in the government, there are some pretty obvious things that we would do. Right, so we'd introduce land reform and land value taxation, try and get lower land prices. We try and get more farmers, not fewer, and we try to get a lot more people into farming from different backgrounds, including from places like the accession states and Syria. So we try to get that innovation and new blood into farming. We'd look at a lot of innovation in terms of low carbon. We'd take the climate change targets agreed in Paris very seriously and see agriculture's primary role as being part of the solution to climate change. And that includes changing our balance between crops for human consumption and crops for animal consumption. We'd put a lot of effort into agroforestry, and we put a lot of effort into using renewables for protected croppings. We've got a lot more renewables than we need in Scotland. We can use some of the waste energy from that to do protected cropping. We would move all the money out of Pillar 1 and put it in Pillar 2. There is no rationale for Pillar 1. Even if you look at the founding statement on Pillar 1, it says in the EU founding treaty it's about protecting farmers from volatility. It just doesn't make any sense as an intervention mechanism, and we need to get rid of it. And we need to support farmers, but we need to support them much more strategically in terms of delivering public goods. We want to shift wholesale to agroecology and have far less pesticides and less antibiotics used in Scottish farming. We want to push towards sustainable consumption and a health-creating environment in our cities and also our rural areas. We want more grass and less grain, and fundamentally we want a new social contract between the people who produce food in Scotland and the people who eat it. So, what's stopping us? Not Europe, except in the matter of Pillar 1, actually. And the question is, can we be part of a movement to shift Pillar 1 policy, to shift common agriculture policy away from Pillar 1 and towards Pillar 2 in the next round? Can we see a shift towards payments being made much more at city region level, and city regions having a much more influence on administering devolved budgets. Could we see some of that? And could we see the actually UK government's Treasury's opposition to Pillar 1 payments continuing, along with the Paris talks, as being a really good opportunity to say we have got to stop subsidizing people just because they own land. That is no longer a sensible use of public money to give people who've already got land money for owning it. So maybe we could do that. But I tell you something, if we stay in the UK and the UK leaves Europe, you've got to remember one thing, the UK is not Norway, right? The UK will not subsidize its farmers. It will not help small farmers stay on the land, right? I refer you to 2 bits of history, the repeal of the Corn Laws, right, in the mid-18th century, and very few of us are old enough to remember that, right? And probably
some
only
of
a
us
handful
teach
of
it
us.
to our students. 1846.
Only a handful of us can remember the 1921 Great Betrayal. So when the servicemen came back from the war and the farmers who'd gone off and fought in the trenches were told, oh, tough, we've got no money to support farms anymore. And that led to the 15-year depression in farming. So the UK government is not going to make life easy for farmers. The UK government is not going to dig us out of this hole. If we want to make a better food and farming system, for all the bureaucracy and from all the impenetrability and for all the industry lobbying, we have to do it in Europe. Thank you.